barren, and she'd had no children, and she cried out to God, and finally God had gave her this son, and she had promised that if she had a son, she would dedicate him to God. So when he was old enough, she took him to the tabernacle, to the at that time, the place of worship, and gave him to the service of God. And Eli was the priest at the time. He was not a good priest. He was overweight, for one thing. That doesn't make him a bad priest, but he was really, really fat. In fact, that's what did him in the end. Now, we're not going to go into all that story today, but there's so many wonderful stories in the Bible. You know, if you want to read about losing weight, well, you need to look at Eli. It cost him his life. He fell over and broke his neck because he was too fat. But anyway, Samuel was the mentor for, Eli was a mentor for Samuel. And Samuel had such a heart for God. Even as a little boy, he heard God speaking to him. And so during this time, when he's being mentored in the tabernacle and all of that, the Ark of the Covenant is taken into battle, which is where it was never to be, and was captured. And if you remember a little bit about this story, when that happened, that's when Eli fell over and died. And one of the sons of Eli said, Ichabod. The word Ichabod means God is departed. And when the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines of all people, it was the presence, it was their tangible presence of God was gone. And the people had already been in enough of rebellion and backslidden state, but now they're really in bad trouble. So the ark has departed. They're worshiping foreign gods. Things are not good. So let's go over to 1 Samuel 8. 1 Samuel 8. That's kind of I've done a real summary of the first part here. And in 1 Samuel 8, verse 4. Now Samuel, by this time, is become a full-fledged priest and prophet. He is now, of course, tending to the worship. The sacrifices are being brought to the tabernacle, even though there's no ark there, but they're still bringing their sacrifices when they think about it. Isn't it funny how there can be cycles like that? People can just kind of get into it's Sunday, we go to church. It's just a habit we do. There's really nothing very, exciting about it or worshipful about it. And this is kind of what was going on. So when we get to chapter 8, verse 4, it says, all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, that's where the tabernacle was, and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to govern us like all the nations. This is not good news. Why do they want a king? Why do they want a king? Because everybody else has one. They want to be like everybody else. Did God intend for Israel to be like everybody else? No. Did he intend for the church to be like everybody else? No. We are set aside, chosen people, aren't we? But you see, they'd forgotten who they were. And so they said, well, we just would like to be like everybody else. Now, back in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses, through God, of course, gave Moses the instruction about the fact that they should not have a king like other nations. That's exactly what it said. They should not ever have a king like other nations do. They will eventually have a king. His name is Jesus. But you see, they wanted an earthly king like everybody else. And God told them back in Deuteronomy, he said, if you have a king, he said that then this will happen. And he did say that if they ever chose a king, the king, now get this, was to literally write out the first 5 books of the Bible. The king was to do that. In his own handwriting, he was to write out the first 5 books, the Torah. He was to write that out and go over and over it. What's God saying? You don't want the king to get into the mentality of the world. They've got to keep focused on God. So they want a king like everybody else. And it's really, really interesting. Look at verse 7. It says, and the Lord said to Samuel, hearken to the voice of the people and all that they say to you, For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. See, it wasn't that they were mad at Samuel, really. They just wanted to be like everybody else. Well, don't get too holier than thou now. You know, I mean, let's just embrace everything. Isn't that kind of what we're hearing today?
Yeah, we are.
Let's be politically correct. We don't want to offend anybody. You know, let's just, you know, kind of calm some of these things down and be like everybody else. And, you know, that's not God's plan. I think it's really interesting. We're not going to take time to read this next section, but there are, I think there's 7 places or 6 places where God says that if you have a king, he will take, look at verse 11. He says, he said to those, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them. Go down to verse 13. He will take your daughters. Verse 14, he will take the best of your fields. Verse 15, he will take 1/10 of your grain. Verse 16, he will take your men servants. 17, he will take 1/10 of your flocks. I thought, man, that's like the government. I mean,
That's right.
isn't it? You know, these are kings. They're going to set themselves up as a government, as a ruling thing, and they're going to take. They're going to take from you. What did those things belong to? The 10th. Who did that belong to?
God.
To God, not to the king. So you know, it's set out very plainly there, isn't it, as to what they should do. God is a giver. He's not a taker. And you know, so many times we don't understand that. I've heard people say, well, you know, all they do in church is take up offerings. They just take your money. Well, you don't give your money to the church. You give your money to God. That's our tithe. That's what we bring. You know, we bring our offering and our tithe to God, not to the church or the ministry. But, you know, people don't get that anyway. Well, that's what we're here for, isn't it? To figure that out. Okay, now let's go over to 1 Samuel 9. 1 Samuel 9. So God begins to instruct Samuel here about anointing a king. And there's a really interesting story. I'm not going to take time to go into in detail. But it tells us that there's a man by the name of Benjamin. Now, number one, Benjamin, that's not his name, that's his tribe. His name is Saul, and he comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, Benjamin was the brother, the real brother of Joseph, you remember, the youngest son of Jacob. But Benjamin was not the kingly line, was it? That was not the kingly tribe. And yet, God said, you go ahead and you can anoint this man to be king. You know, I think lots of times God allows us to take a substitute so we will learn that we did not take best choice. He'll allow that. And then, you know, we learn from that was not God's choice and the reason for that. It's interesting, however, Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, gave us Paul. Paul was a Benjamite. And so in the New Testament, you know, it's not that Benjamin was a bad tribe or anything, he just was not to be the king. But Saul is the one who he's lost some donkeys of his father's, and he's gone to look for them and everything. And he's really tall. He's very good looking. He's very tall. He looks kingly. You know, sometimes people are chosen by just the way they look.
Oh, yeah.
Or what they have, or the way they present themselves, or whatever. And so that's kind of the way this was. And so, anyway, people really liked this man, and he's a good son. He's looking for his father's donkeys, and he can't find them. And eventually they decide they should probably ask a man of God, somebody who has a prophetic kind of anointing that maybe could help them. And they do that, and so when all of that's taking place, God speaks to Samuel and tells him that he's going to bring this man to him, and he is to anoint him as king. Now, he's really the people's choice. He's not God's choice. So then over in chapters 10 and to 11, we find that Samuel anoints Saul. The spirit of prophecy even comes on him, and he speaks prophetic words. He moves under an anointing of God, and like I say, he stands tall. It looks like he's really a princely kind of guy. He has a son by the name of Jonathan, who really, in many ways, kind of becomes the king. Jonathan seems to have more understanding about how to have leadership than Saul does. And so in chapter 15, go clear over to chapter 15. I'm just going to kind of move through this fairly quickly. Chapter 15, Samuel tells Saul that he is going to come and he's going to sacrifice, make a sacrifice to God. And so Saul thinks this is a big deal. This is a big deal now. Going to get all the people around. Of course, Saul will be there. He'll be the king. And then Samuel's going to come and sacrifice these animals. Well, Samuel doesn't come. He's delayed. He doesn't come. And this is a big event. Have you ever been in a big event and the main person doesn't come? And, then what happens? Many times, those in charge get very nervous. And they think, well, we better do something. So they'll stick in a substitute, which is not God's. And that's exactly what happens here. It's the kind of thing that, is so common. I mean, it's the kind of thing that we feel like we have to do. We got to do something. And so Saul goes ahead and sacrifices these animals. He's not a priest. See, you have to remember that especially in the Old Testament, I mean, God was very strict about who he set up as what. And so he goes ahead and he yields to the people and to himself mainly. He wants to look good in front of everybody. And so he does the sacrifice. Okay, first Samuel 15, verse 22. Verse 22. Samuel arrives. And he says, what have you done? What have you done? And of course he has to admit what he's done. There has been a battle take place, and we were supposed to kill all of the bad people, and he didn't do that. And Samuel knows everything is in disarray. And so it's really interesting here in verse 22, Samuel gives a prophetic word. This is definitely a prophecy right here. Samuel said, has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? See, what's important? Is it sacrifices? Is it doing the religious thing? Or is it obeying God? He said, better to obey is, behold, I'll say this right. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. I mean, this is really where Saul comes down. I mean, he's still king for a while, but he has no anointing. No anointing to be king anymore. Because he has totally disobeyed. He has totally disobeyed. And disobeying God is not something to take lightly. That's what this says here. It's far better to obey than to do all the religious things. Even giving. If you give with the wrong kind of heart, that's not the way you're supposed to obey, is it? So we're going to just stop here for a moment, and I want to have a little table talk. What I want you to talk about is, when have maybe you yielded to people rather than to God? Or when have you disobeyed, thinking maybe you were doing the right thing, but later on you realized that that really was not God's plan? And I want you just to try to be as open as you can about that, to think about something that you have yielded to people, and that we've all done this. Sometimes we have remained quiet when we should have said something. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we've said something when we should have remained quiet. And so let's just talk about that and share that a little bit, okay?